isolated domestic incident. So the suspect shot the mother of the children first, then responded to this location and shot 8 children, 7 of which being his own. There was an additional child at this residence that was not akin to him. However, we're still working on relationships and whose parents whose, but it's a very hectic scene. There's a lot to investigate, a lot to unpack.
8 children, 3 homes, 1 man. And less than 24 hours before the first shot was fired, he was posting Easter photos with every single one of them. So what happens inside a man's mind between Saturday's smile and Sunday's massacre? Shreveport's police chief, someone who had spent decades inside the worst crime scenes in Louisiana, stood in front of cameras and admitted that what his officers found that morning broke something in even the most seasoned veterans on the force. So here's the question that nobody can answer. How do you post a Father of the Year moment on Friday, take your oldest child out on Saturday, and walk through 3 houses killing 8 of your own children before sunrise on Sunday? And how did absolutely nobody see it coming? The police chief who stood in front of cameras that morning was a man who had spent his career inside hard rooms, inside difficult cases, inside the particular silence that follows the worst things human beings do to one another. He had seen things that do not leave you. He had processed scenes that required him to place a professional wall between what he was looking at and what he was feeling so that the work could continue. That morning, he stood in front of cameras and said plainly that this scene was unlike anything most of his officers had ever encountered. He did not say it to generate headlines. He did not say it for effect. He said it because it was the truest sentence available to him in that moment. And he was a man who had enough experience to know the difference between something that felt unprecedented and something that actually was. If you are new here, welcome to Obsidian Echoes, where crime has tail. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. The mayor stood beside him and reached for language. He quoted a poet. He said the city was hurting. He said maybe this was the worst tragedy Shreveport had ever seen. The word maybe was not hedging. It was not a politician being careful about his phrasing. It was a man who had processed a great deal of public pain across his years in that role, standing at the threshold of something that exceeded all of it, and still trying to be precise, still trying to be accurate, because the situation demanded accuracy, and the word maybe was the most honest word he had available. 8 children, ages 1 through 14, all found dead before 7 in the morning, all found in homes that belonged to their family, all killed by someone who knew their faces, who had eaten meals in those rooms, who had sat at those tables, who had watched those children grow from infants into the ages they were when they died. There is a particular category of violence that the human brain resists processing, not because it is too graphic, not because the details are too explicit, but because the premise itself is structurally wrong. The brain searches for the error. It looks for the part of the sentence that was mistranscribed, the number that was misread, the detail that, once corrected, will make the sentence mean something survivable. 8 children killed in a domestic shooting. The brain reads it, puts it down, picks it up, reads it again. The number does not change. Shreveport sits in the northwest corner of Louisiana, in Caddo Parish, bordered to the east by Bossier Parish across the Red River. Cedar Grove is a residential neighborhood on the city's northwest side. It is the kind of neighborhood that does not generate much coverage on ordinary days. People go to work, children go to school, neighbors know each other not formally, not through introductions, but through the accumulated knowledge of proximity, whose car sits in which driveway, which house gets allowed on Friday nights, which porch light stays on, the kind of knowing that builds without anyone deciding to build it. On the morning of April 6, 2025, Cedar Grove became the kind of neighborhood that people outside of it would know by name. Leave a comment telling show where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The first calls to Shreveport police came in just before 6 in the morning. Shots fired. 300 block of West 79th Street. When officers arrived, the scene they found did not have clean borders. It stretched. It pulled in an address on Harrison Street, then another adjacent residence on West 79th. The crime scene kept expanding as officers worked to understand what they were dealing with. Corporal Chris Bordelon, the officer who would later face cameras to explain what they had found, described working multiple properties simultaneously, a scene that required extensive processing simply to understand its geography before anyone could begin to understand its cause. 10 people had been shot. 8 of them were children. The 2 adults who survived had both been struck in the head. One was in critical, life-threatening condition. The other was serious but survivable. And somewhere inside one of those homes, a young boy connected to the family had climbed to a window and jumped from the roof. Not a stumble, not a fall, a deliberate decision. A choice made because whatever was happening in the rooms below had made falling from that height the better option. The man believed to be responsible had not vanished into a gap in the geography. He carjacked a vehicle at gunpoint half a block from the original scene, at the corner of West 79th and Linwood, and drove across the parish line into Bossier. The chase ended on the 400 block of Brampton Lane, where officers opened fire. He was dead before the morning was over. His name was Shamar Elkins. He was 31 years old. According to reports circulating widely before formal confirmation, he was the father of those children. He walked through those rooms. He knew every one of those faces. And that is the fact that the brain keeps trying to find its way around. This is not a story of a stranger. It is not a story of a break-in, a robbery, a random act of violence that arrived from outside. It is a story about the rooms that were supposed to be the safest ones in the world, and what happened inside them on a Sunday morning in April when everyone else in Cedar Grove was still asleep. The violence did not arrive without context. It arrived in a shape that, looked at clearly and in full sequence, carries its own internal logic. The warnings were not hidden in encrypted records or buried in classified files. They were on Facebook. They were in a decade of relationship history. They were in a pattern that researchers who study this specific category of crime have documented across hundreds of cases with uncomfortable consistency. None of that makes what happened predictable in the way that would have allowed someone to stop it, but it makes it legible. And that legibility is the honest place to begin. 8 children, 1 man. A Sunday morning in Shreveport, Louisiana that nobody in that community will ever come back from. What follows is an account of how it happened, what was known, what was missed, and what those 8 lives meant before they were taken. 2 days before the shooting, Shamar Elkins posted on Facebook. The post was about Easter, about having all of his kids together, about the particular kind of satisfaction that comes from gathering the people you love in one place and documenting it, putting it into the public record of your social media feed so that the people who know you can see what your life looks like when it is at its best. The post had the texture of an ordinary, proud parent moment, the kind of content that sits in any given Facebook feed on Easter weekend, alongside similar posts from other people doing similar things. Families gathered, children photographed, meals prepared, a holiday documented and shared. It generated likes, it generated comments. The people who saw it moved on with their Sunday. The day before the shooting, Saturday, the last day that anything in those households was ordinary, he posted again. This one was about taking his oldest child out, just the 2 of them, a father and child outing, documented and shared with the same ease as the Easter post. The kind of gesture that reads as warmth, as investment, as a man choosing to be present in the life of his child in a way that is visible and intentional. The people who saw it commented on it. They liked it. They moved on. Nobody reading that feed saw what was sitting underneath it. That is not a criticism of the people who missed it. That absence of recognition is precisely the point of the performance. It was designed to be seen and believed. And it was. Shamar Elkins was 31 years old at the time of the shooting. He was embedded in Cedar Grove, connected to those homes, connected to the women who would survive him, connected to the children he had fathered. He was not a figure who had drifted into the neighborhood from somewhere unknown. He was woven into it, into the specific streets, the specific households, the specific lives that existed inside those three addresses. What could have driven a father to kill his own children just a day after taking pictures with them? Before we find out, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The woman identified on Facebook as Shamar Elkins had been with him for 10 years. A decade. That is not a short-term connection. That is not a relationship whose end is uncomplicated or clean. 10 years is a span of time that builds its own weight, its own accumulated history of mornings and evenings and arguments and reconciliations and decisions made together and decisions avoided together and children born and children growing. They had 4 girls together, 4 daughters who were alive on Saturday and were not alive by Sunday morning. If you are enjoying the crime tale, please like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating crime tales. They had married on April 9th, 2024, a year and 3 days before the shooting. A license filed, a ceremony held, a future implied. Whatever the private reality of that household was in the months between the wedding and the morning of April 6th, the external record shows a man who was photographed at family gatherings, who posted his children on social media, who appeared in the ordinary documentation of a functioning family life. Whatever was happening underneath that presentation was not visible from the outside, or if it was sensed, it was explained away. The children ranged in age from 1-year-old to 14, 8 children. The range of those ages is significant in a way that goes beyond the number itself. You do not have a 1-year-old and a 14-year-old under the same circumstances without a span of years in which that family existed as a living, developing unit. There were routines inside those homes. There were birthdays. There was a 1-year-old learning the basic mechanics of the world and a 14-year-old navigating the particular complexity of early adolescence, and 6 children at every age in between with their own specific relationships to the household, their own specific relationships to one another, their own specific understanding of who the adults in their lives were. The 14-year-old is the one that is hardest to sit with. At that age, you understand what is happening around you. You carry the weight of being the oldest in a room full of younger ones. You have a developed capacity to understand danger and to feel responsible and to want to do something. Whether the 14-year-old tried to do something in those final moments is not part of the documented record. There was not enough time for the official account to answer that question. What the official account does confirm is that the oldest victim in that house was still a child, and that the man who killed them was supposed to be the person they were safest with in the world. Cedar Grove, the neighborhood where those homes sat, is the kind of residential area where people know each other through proximity rather than through formal social structures. Residents described it in terms that are consistent with a community that functions quietly, that handles its own dynamics internally, that does not carry much of its private life into the public record. No prior domestic disturbance calls to those addresses had been publicly reported by the time the investigation's early details became available. No restraining orders had surfaced. No child welfare intervention had been named. If the system had a file on that household, it was not acknowledged in the public record in the days following the shooting. The family, by the available external evidence, had presented to the surrounding community as a household that managed its internal life without generating official documentation. That is not unusual. Most households do. Most of the pressure and fracture and conflict that exist inside a family exists away from the eyes of neighbors, away from formal systems, away from the kind of documentation that later allows a picture to be assembled in hindsight. People who live in proximity to a family know what is available to be known from a reasonable distance. The sound of raised voices bleeding through walls at an unusual hour, the pattern of comings and goings that shifts without explanation. the general emotional temperature of a household as it makes itself felt through behavior, through the quality of interactions and shared spaces, through the things that are not said as much as the things that are. But they do not know what happens in the rooms where the door is closed and the voices are kept low because the children are in the next room. The community members who spoke on social media in the hours after the shooting described Elkins in terms that consistently returned to the same words: present, a father who showed up, not publicly feared, not flagged, not the person on the block that people pointed to when they were explaining their unease. The portrait that came back from the people who knew him, within an hour of the first breaking news alerts hitting their phones, was not the portrait of a man who had been performing a version of himself that was visible and functional, and, to the people around him, credible. According to posts circulating on Facebook, he was a former United States Army veteran. That detail, if accurate, adds a specific dimension to the portrait. The military trains its people in ways that are relevant here, not as an explanation, not as a justification, but as a contextual layer that changes how certain things are read. The military trains compartmentalization, the ability to function under pressure, the ability to maintain an external presentation regardless of what is happening internally, the ability to keep the mission moving when the internal state is something other than calm. Those skills become habitual. They become part of the way a person moves through the world. And in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, that is a functional adaptation that makes people effective in difficult circumstances. In some cases, in a documented subset of cases, that skill set finds a different application. The gap between what someone presents and what they are capable of becomes larger than the surrounding community understands, because the person maintaining the gap has been trained to maintain it. That gap is one of the most consistently documented features in the research on familicide, the category of violence in which a man kills members of his own family, often in the context of a relationship ending or a perceived loss of control. Consistently produces the same surrounding testimony from people who knew the perpetrator. He seemed normal. He showed up. Nobody saw it coming. That testimony is not a failure of the people giving it. It is a feature of the dynamic itself. The performance is sustained specifically because it needs to be sustained to function. The moment the performance becomes unnecessary is the moment it ends. On Friday, Elkins posted about Easter. On Saturday, he posted about taking his oldest child out for a day together. On Sunday morning, before 6 o'clock, the shooting began. The 3 days exist in sequence. They do not explain each other, but they sit together in a way that, once you know what Sunday morning produced, makes the preceding days feel like a held breath. The warmth of the Easter post, the intentionality of the father and child outing, the careful, sustained documentation of a man who was fully present in his children's lives. None of it was false in the simple sense of the word. He was there. He did show up. He did take his oldest child out on Saturday. The documentation was real. What it was documenting was a performance, and the performance was running right up to the edge of something that the people around him could not see. According to accounts circulating widely on social media in the hours after the shooting, Shamar Elkins had been planning to leave. That detail arrived in the public record not through an official statement, not through a press conference, not through the kind of verified, sourced journalism that produces a confirmed fact. It arrived through a Facebook Live filmed at the scene by someone who claimed to know the family. Unconfirmed, circulated widely regardless, the kind of information that spreads in the immediate aftermath of a mass casualty event, when official channels are still processing the geography of what happened, and the people who are close to the family have nowhere else to put what they know. Unconfirmed is not the same as untrue, and the shape of what happened on the morning of April 6th fits the detail about a planned separation with a precision that is difficult to set aside. The research on this specific category of violence, on men who killed their families in the context of a relationship ending, finds that the trigger is almost always the same. Not the relationship deteriorating, not the conflict escalating, The specific, concrete moment when the ending becomes real, when it stops being a threat or a possibility or something that exists in the future tense and becomes something that is actually happening on a specific timeline in the present tense. That transition from potential to actual, from feared to inevitable, is consistently identified in the literature as the pressure point. A separation being planned is not the same as a separation having happened, but to someone whose sense of self is bound up in controlling the people around him, the distinction may not hold. The planning is enough. The knowledge that the exit is being prepared, that the terms of the life he has built are about to change on someone else's terms, carries the same weight as the exit itself. It triggers the same internal response. And in a subset of men with a controlling personality structure and a capacity for extreme violence, that response does not look like grief or collapse or the visible unraveling that people around them would recognize and respond to. It looks, from the outside, like an Easter post. It looks like taking your oldest child out for the day. It looks like a man who is fully present and fully composed, because the composure is what allows the planning to continue without interference. What happened in the hours between Saturday evening and 6 o'clock Sunday morning is not in the official record. The documented timeline begins with the first calls to police just before 6th. What led to those calls, what conversation or confrontation or sequence of events unfolded inside those homes in the hours before dawn, is a question the investigation would work to answer in the days and weeks that followed. What is documented is the outcome of whatever those hours contained. The shooting began on West 79th Street. It did not stay there. That is the detail that tells you the most about what happened before any motive is confirmed, before any official statement names a cause. The violence moved. It did not erupt in one location and end there. It crossed thresholds. It moved from one address to another through decisions made at each threshold. A residence on West 79th, a residence on Harrison Street, another address connected to the family. Each address required a decision to proceed. Each threshold crossed was a choice made in sequence, in the early morning dark, before the neighborhood had woken up. That is not the shape of a man who lost control in a single explosive moment and then could not stop. That is the shape of deliberate movement through space, sequential, purposeful. The legal framing for what that sequence represents in Louisiana and in most jurisdictions is premeditated intent, not a loss of control, a series of choices. Corporal Bordelon confirmed when asked by reporters that there was one shooter, one man. He was unambiguous. No one else fired a single round across any of those locations. The violence that moved across 3 addresses that produced 10 gunshot victims, 8 of them fatal, was the work of one person making decisions at each step. Residents of Cedar Grove who were awake early that morning or who were awoken by the sound described what they heard on TikTok in the hours after the news broke. They did not describe a single gunshot. They described a sustained stretch of firing, long enough to register as unusual, long enough to make them go still before they processed what it was and explained it away or did not explain it away. The gap between that sound and whatever anyone did with it in the moment it was heard is a question the investigation would carry. What is clear is that the sound was there to be heard, and that its duration carried information that, in hindsight, could not be more plain. Inside one of the homes, a boy climbed to a window and jumped from the roof. That image does not require an official statement to communicate what it means. A child who decides that jumping from a roof is preferable to remaining in the building has made an assessment of the situation inside. He has weighed the options available to him and determined that the fall from that height represents the better outcome. The calculation that produces that decision is not the calculation of a child who is uncertain about the danger he is in. It is the calculation of a child who has no remaining uncertainty at all. He survived the jump. He survived what came after it. What he carries from that morning is a different category of question, one that a criminal investigation cannot answer, and a verdict cannot resolve. The two adult women who were shot had both been struck in the head. One was in critical, life-threatening condition when she arrived at the hospital. The other was in serious, but survivable. Police confirmed that at least one of the women had been in a relationship with Elkins. Social media posts identified her as Shaniqua. A decade of history, 4 daughters, a marriage certificate dated April 9, 2024, and, according to the unconfirmed but widely circulated account from the Facebook Live filmed at the scene, a plan to leave. The official record did not confirm a motive in the immediate days following the shooting. The domestic classification, the category assigned to the incident in the first press conference and maintained in subsequent statements, is a framework. It describes the relationship between the perpetrator and the victims. It does not describe the internal sequence of events, the conversation that may have taken place, the specific precipitating moment, the precise thing that moved a man to get up before 6 in the morning on a Sunday and walk through those rooms. The domestic classification tells you the category. It does not tell you the hours before 6. Those hours are still in significant part a gap in the documented record. What happened inside them is reconstructible only in broad outline from the pattern of what came after. And what came after was a crime scene that stretched across 3 addresses, 10 victims, 8 of them children, and a man who was dead before the morning ended. The first disturbance was not the gunshots. The first disturbance was whatever happened in the days and hours before the gunshots, in the private space of a household where things were handled quietly and nothing was visible from outside. That disturbance had been building in a place where there was no public record to document its progression. The absence of a prior public record is its own kind of information. Leave a comment where you are watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay safe.